How's it going, everybody? So this is some really fun news. I'm doing something a little different for this episode. Today I'm going to be talking to Dr. Robert Rakove from Stanford University, who has just published this extraordinarily interesting book, Days of Opportunity, the United States and Afghanistan Before the Soviet Invasion. This is new from Columbia University Press, and it is a really interesting book if you were interested in that part of the world. Now, you guys know I'm a Civil War historian. I'm a 19th century Americanist, and I don't typically venture into these topics, but this time, hey, we got to do different stuff. And so I had Rob on. If you remember, Rob and I went to grad school together at the University of Virginia, and if you follow this podcast, and you have been for a while, you'll know that way back in 2016, Rob was one of the very first guests on this show talking about another book that he wrote. This is his new one, and it's good. And Rob is a fun guy to have on these things. He's a really, really smart dude and talks about some interesting stuff. I wish we had more time. We have to limit these conversations to an hour or so, and I wish we had more time to talk, so maybe I'll have him on again because I have lots more questions. This is not an area that I'm particularly familiar with, and so I love to learn about new stuff, and you should too. So listen to this, and please subscribe to the channel. Of course, come on, and leave your comments below. Love to hear what you think. All right, enjoy. All right, Rob. Hey, what's going on? Welcome to the show. It's good to see you again. How you been?
Great, Keith. Likewise, it's an honor. We don't do this enough, but it's good. It's good to get together and talk shop when we can.
We don't do this enough, and if you recall, you were among the first years ago to be I think the first two or three people I had on the show, like back in 2016, when we were talking about your previous unaligned world book in the Cold War and all that stuff, and now we're back and we're talking about Afghanistan, and it's cool. And it's cool to have. Yeah, I've got my. I have to send this to you to get it signed.
Yeah.
Send it to you to get it signed. Now, look, for those of you who don't know, Rob and I went to graduate school together at the great University of Virginia, Mr. Jefferson's University, and we spent many, many years in the same classrooms, going on the same field trips with Gary Gallagher, doing all kinds of fun stuff. And so Rob and I go way back, and so it's nice to catch up. And you're at Stanford now, and it's nice to see that you're doing so well, and it's good to see you. So hey. Welcome, man.
Thanks, Keith. It's great that you're kind of providing this wonderful forum to talk about history and why we get into it, the choices we make, what keeps us working on a specific problem day in and day out. I think you got this kind of this unique connection, this forum that we can have and explore the craft of history in ways I don't think I often hear.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that, and that's precisely what the whole point of this is. I've always thought about the accessibility of history and how a lot of people in the general public, look at the ivory tower and with a bit of disdain, thinking that there's it's an elitist group of people who are they don't function well in the real world. And I don't know. Sometimes I think maybe that's true to a certain extent, but for the most part, I like to bring folks on. In the scholarly world, bring them on and talk to informed readers, well-read public, and talk about stuff. Now, you just recently finished this book, published this book, Days of Opportunity: The United States and Afghanistan Before the Soviet Invasion. Here it is again. I read this with great interest. Now, everybody knows that here I'm wearing my Army of the Potomac shirt. I'm a Americanist, 19th century guy, Civil War. So this isn't, in my bailiwick, really. This isn't something that I would generally gravitate towards, but I read it with great interest. I remember when I was a kid, and I'm old, when I was a kid in the 1970s, 1980s, around 1980 especially, in Afghanistan was in the news a lot. It was the Soviet invasion. It was the boycott of the Olympics from one side or the other, that all hinged on the conflict, Cold War conflict, the 80s version, late 70s, 80s version of the Cold War conflict. It really hinged on Afghanistan. And to me, when I was a kid, I didn't know anything about Afghanistan. And still, I think a lot of people today look at Afghanistan as like, kind of where is this place? Why is it so significant? Why is it so important when it comes to geopolitics? And this is where you come in. Now, most Americans who know anything at all about Afghanistan know it from a recent conflict with the United States and Afghanistan, with Taliban and the Taliban and all that there. But really, probably are
not that familiar with what goes on there, especially in the history of the 20th century. So this is where you come in. So your book talks about Afghanistan pre-Soviet invasion. Let me just say a couple of things before I ask you questions about this. I found the writing uh, very pleasurable. There are little jokes in there. Now, if you know Rob, Rob's got a great sense of humor, a very subtle sense of humor, a very dry and very witty guy. And there's little things in there that crack me up. The Catch-22 joke early on, your comments about having scintillating conversations with Calvin Coolidge, that that made me laugh out loud. History nerd stuff. If you know anything about Calvin Coolidge, that made me laugh out loud. You talk about a guy with his cats and dragging his cats around. So this is good stuff. So Rob, tell me first of all, tell me what brought you to this topic, why you find it interesting, and why we should care about Afghanistan in the 20th century.
You know, I'm on a similar page with you here in terms of roots of this. There is ever the slightest gap between us in age. I got the same memories as you do.
Mm-hmm.
I think they started sometime in the 80s. I think the first, like, I can remember the 84 election, for example, and I can remember the concrete sense that the Soviet Union was having its own Vietnam-like war in Afghanistan, and like that last scary decade of the Cold War. And so, and then there came a certain point in the middle of the decade in which that National Geographic cover, Afghan Girl, was omnipresent. It was everywhere, and it seemed to kind of just sort of capture the disruption and the drama of that war. But I think I developed an interest in it before the conflict, and a sense that there was so much more to the story, and that came kind of bit by bit in undergraduate classes. Key elements of this happened because I just was looking at Afghan documents in the process of writing my last book. And it started to seem very strange to me that it had been plunged into the Cold War the way that it was, because you take the wide view. You look at how Afghans are regarded for much of the Cold War as these sort of ace practitioners of neutrality, or be more precise, non-alignment, that they just sort of intrinsically know how to stay at the middle, at the median, and to avoid angering either superpower. And I had just looked for my prior book at cases where a non-aligned leader would not stay at the median of the road. Where the Indonesian President Sukarno at one point told Americans to go to hell with your aid, his words. Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser told Americans to go drink from the Red Sea. Uh, Afghans were not doing that. They were not. Not only were they not making inflammatory statements, they're also acting very carefully to try to avoid angering neither superpower. So how exactly that balancing act was lost became very interesting to me, because you take the long view, and they nearly got through the Cold War. They nearly got through the Cold War without getting plunged into it. They could have been just a sort of non-aligned success story if you carry that balancing act forward a bit longer. That was one element. Another was just how much Americans liked the country. How much you take the images before 78, and it's a pleasant place to visit. I was actually kind of curious if you'd had any prior images of it, and maybe I think it only had a certain level of visibility in American life, a low one before 78, before the coup, and then before it plunged into civil war. But it was basically an adventure travel destination before that. It was not, I mean, it was regarded as an impoverished country, but it had great scenery. A lot of people were going there for kind of rugged sightseeing, admittedly. Some of that travel related to the availability of opium in the country, but it's not necessarily the preponderance of it. I wouldn't presume that. But it didn't carry the associations we have with it. One of the common terms I encounter these days is graveyard of empires. That, to the best of my knowledge, other people have written this, only seems to have really been stapled to Afghanistan in the present century. It came up a lot in late 2001 as the US was preparing for its campaign against the Taliban. It's not that nobody had put that phrase together, but they actually, before 2001, seemed to have been associating it wildly in different places. I just on a lark once did a Google book search and found Graveyard of Empires wasn't associated with Afghanistan. People, among other things, associated it with the Fertile Crescent in Iraq. Not
Mhm.
to say, oh, this unconquerable place with uh, fierce people defending it, but just to say there have been a lot of different empires here. It's just to sort of look at the passage of time. It brings to mind the Ozymandias poem, for example. So taking a step back from those images, understanding how contingent, one of the great words of our grad school experience, how many sort of twists in the road there were, how many different opportunities, keyword from the title, loomed for Afghanistan and for the countries that engage with it, I think was kind of liberating. And
Mhm.
I hope there were not frustrating moments in the book where you wished I would flip to the present, to the war. I was really doing everything I could to keep recent events at arm's length, because I think flashing forward, taking were I to move from the 50s or the 60s suddenly into the 21st century, or even the 80s or 90s would be distracting. It would it would diminish the sort of lost past that I was trying to convey. These are some of the different things that just kind of that compelled me to the project. Above all, I think I liked it because I had the sense it hadn't been done. I really like going off road. I think where the literature, where the historiography is concerned, I think it can be very liberating, especially when you get the sense you're encountering people whose stories have not really fully been told. Uh,
Mhm.
there were moments researching this that got really exciting for me because I would encounter these really detailed stories that I was absolutely certain, and I think remain absolutely certain, have not been fully explored. The third chapter, just to pick one at random, begins with the adventures in 1947-48 of this mining consultant, Miles Walsh, not a famous figure in U.S. history, who goes to Afghanistan. It's this absolutely crazy voyage there. I won't spoil it. But then finds himself in a place called the Panjshir Valley, which is later made famous because during the Soviet war, it was the famous redoubt of the Afghan Mujahideen commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, who basically just led the Soviets on a merry chase repeatedly there, and they could never bring him to heel. Until the Taliban came to power. They detest him. Until the Taliban came to power, he was a national hero there. But back in 47-48, it wasn't a place of violence. It wasn't a place of insurgency or counterinsurgency. It was just an interesting place to look for minerals. And so Walsh, on his own, using narratives from Arab geographers that had been written 1,000 years ago, his father had given them to him as like a going away present before he set sail, was just kind of crawling, at times, yes, crawling into like old abandoned mine passages looking for mineral elements. I just found this, and he was just recording this in a matter of fact way. I just found this amazing account, and just thinking about the different ways by which people approach the country that have no resemblance whatsoever to the associations, to the ways Americans think about Afghanistan today. That was just tremendously encouraging as I was asking myself that really terrible question off the bat: Do I have a project here? Do I have a project here? It really, the very difficult question we all face at the very outset.
We always face that question, Rob. But let me ask you, you mentioned something I thought was pretty interesting, is that you tell this story, and multiple stories that you tell in this book, without always having that kind of the 1980s, the Soviet invasion kind of looming ahead. Now, it's one of those things. I think it's important that we withdraw from that kind of thing from time to time. I was reading something about Richard Nixon the other day, and Nixon Revisited, I think is the name of the book. And the premise of the book is that we want to look at Nixon without having Watergate looming over us all the time, because it's going to color the way we think about it, right? And I think that it does distort the way we think about things. And in terms of Afghanistan, when I came to this book, the first thing that came to my mind, of course, was the conflict that had been going on there since the 1980s, which is, for my own personal memory, is how I understand Afghanistan. And so that's what does make his story a lot more interesting, to me anyway, is not to have that constantly inserted into as if we know it's coming, right? That's something that you and I talked about in graduate school all the time, this idea that we should read history forward and not always have that piece in our head as if every decision everybody makes is going to ultimately lead us down this particular path, which of course it isn't. We talk about contingency history, right? And so that's something that I found great about this book. Now, what what is it about? Is it geographical? Is the minerals available there, the opium available there? What is it that drew people to Afghanistan? Yeah, the geography of the nation really kind of struck me as something very interesting here in relation to, especially post World War II, and the competition between the superpowers. The geography would play into this pretty significantly. Can you speak to that a little bit?
That's a great question. I'd say there's something endlessly changeable about how the country is understood geographically. A lot of people approach it and they have a kind of understanding of it as a traditional invasion route, often actually into South Asia. They have notions of campaigns in prior centuries. John F. Kennedy, when he was introducing the Afghan king, who made a state visit in September 1963, recalled the campaigns of Alexander the Great, which had crossed through it. So you can see it as a route into the subcontinent. That was an idea that Americans had in the early Cold War. Move forward to the turn of the 80s, and it was understood, not very accurately, I think, but it was understood to be potentially an invasion route toward the Persian Gulf. So we got two big bright arrows pointing southwest and southeast. There's another arrow that maybe points a bit north. The United States liked the notion of Afghanistan as a place from which the Soviet Union could be monitored in its most secretive locations. Americans, one of the great arguments for an American presence in Afghanistan was that it could be used to monitor Soviet Central Asia, which for Americans was basically the dark side of the moon. They had no idea what was going on there at all, especially in the 30s and into the 1940s. And one the strange element of the story maybe is that Americans took 20 years after Afghanistan established its independence to actually develop a diplomatic mission there. This was an era in which the United States was actually quite standoffish. So we can get to that, but there was also, though, and you note the minerals, a sense of economic opportunity there that draws a really interesting eclectic group of characters. A lot of sort of ragged entrepreneurs. This is a part of the story I had to unfortunately cut back a little bit for the usual sort of trying editorial reasons, but you get kind of this peculiar cast of characters in the 20s or the 30s who appear in the United States claiming they've just scored a concession on one thing or another, a mining concession usually, and would the United States now support them and offer them representation in Afghanistan? I think if you're looking for commercial opportunity in the world, it's there for you. And actually, there was an interesting, often I think, kind of bizarre discourse in the 21st century. People talking about the still undeveloped mineral wealth of Afghanistan. That's entirely true. Among other things, I think the U.S. military would periodically note that, well, there's $1 trillion or so of precious minerals under the ground there, and if everybody could just put down the rifles, there could be a great economic opportunity in developing them. When that was coming out, people would say that's actually quite old news. One element of the story that I don't think gets as much attention, and these days I think maybe it would just seem sort of less important given the shift in the global energy economy, was Afghanistan has oil. It's not in an especially convenient place. It's in the north of the country, which makes it harder to get to market, at least it especially did at that point in time. But Afghans were really trying to get a U.S. oil company or two on the hook because they figured rightly, if they get an oil company involved, the United States itself will have to follow. If there are several hundred American oil workers, not the most peaceful and harmonious of people necessarily in Afghanistan, the State Department's going to have to represent them in Kabul, and that'll create a broader relationship that in turn gives Afghanistan room to maneuver. Because whatever the decade, Afghanistan is just below the Soviet Union, or briefly for my purposes, Tsarist Russia. It needs friends that it doesn't share a border with that might help it get some kind of diplomatic maneuverability in the world. It's also, of course, bordering for much of the story British India. There's no great love of the British there. Ideally, they find patrons whom they're not directly connected with, who perhaps engage in mutually beneficial arrangements and improve their ability to remain independent and out of conflict. And so even before the Cold War, this was something they did unusually well. But then I think the last leg of the table here, as far as your question goes, is what interests Americans. You have individual Americans who see economic opportunity. Yeah, I think I've spoken to that, but I think they really like the place. A lot of Americans really like the place. Another chapter begins with a guy's hunting expedition, a U.S. ambassador. U.S. ambassadors were, for some reason, well, I could get into it, avid hunters. They tended to really like shooting large animals. In the strangest part of Afghanistan, looking at on the map, the northeast Wakhan corridor, this little finger of land that connects it ever so briefly to China. This fellow Henry Byrod was going on a high altitude, I think like 15,000 feet hunting expedition. They
Mhm.
really liked it. It had this proliferation of lovely outdoor scenery, crisp mountain air. I didn't think they liked Kabul so much, which had all of the inconveniences of a mid-sized city. And there's a lot. One of the things I did was look at a lot of their complaints about post-living conditions in the late 40s, but much of the country was very enjoyable to them. Several of my subjects would later sort of retire in the Front Range area of Colorado. They were looking for similar conditions, crisp mountain air, extensive sort of mountain scenery. And I think the Afghans themselves were often very welcoming, could often, I think, kind of impress their guests with the sense of hospitality. I don't get into it so much because my training is not as cultural, but I think there's an interesting cultural overlap that Americans seem to appreciate. Vice President Spiro Agnew, who pops up in a later chapter, describes the Afghans as thinking and speaking more like Americans than any other people in Asia he's encountered. And so I think that kind of American affinity for the country is maybe the last missing piece of the puzzle in terms of explaining what draws Americans to there.
That's one of the things that I found most fascinating, to be honest with you, when I was reading this book, as somebody who does have a little bit more in his finger of the pot of cultural history, is that we think of in anybody born in the late 20th century and come of age in the 21st century, think of Afghanistan as a war torn region, a terrorist enclave, what have you. And we don't think of it as a vacation destination. That struck me as very interesting. Oh wow, it's I can imagine these guys, where they're packing into the mountains, into the wilderness, so to speak, to hunt big game. It's very, very Teddy Roosevelt esque, with, right, where they go off and
Yeah.
things. It's like a romanticized version of what we understand Afghanistan to be, and so it's like an exotic destination where most Americans don't go. And so if you have the means to do so, then it seems like a cool place to go. That completely caught me by surprise, to be honest with you. Since I'm not an expert in that region of the world, that's something that I found very, very interesting. Another thing that I found interesting was this sort of, especially post World War II, late 1940s, 1950s, right when the Cold War begins to escalate and the potential for a great conflagration loomed, for both political, the polarized world. And since I read your other book about non-aligned countries, I really thought that the Afghans were interesting here in that they seem to be playing both sides of this fairly well. And I know that both the Americans and the Soviets are enticing the Afghans to come over to their side. What kind of things do the Americans do in terms of building infrastructure, providing economic aid, any of these kinds of, what kind of things do the Americans do to entice the Afghans into their camp, into their political camp, and were they successful?
Hmm. It's actually it's an interesting case because you get this whole array of different projects, and I think it got to be kind of an observation or a tenet on my part that whatever facet of the Cold War you're looking at, there's an Afghan story to be uncovered. They have this just kind of amazingly eclectic set of appeals. Their economic agenda was remarkably diverse, and so there's sort of something for everybody within the study of modern development in the case of Afghanistan. I should distinguish a bit between the actions of private contractors and the U.S. government. The things that the sort of the deals that Washington arranged without becoming involved firsthand, and on the one hand, but then on the other, the cases where they actually rushed forward to meet a specific Afghan request and were much more hands-on in their response. in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, but related to a lot of promises that had been made during the war, during the war's final stages. And the war had completely disrupted Afghan efforts to modernize specific parts of their economy. The United States brokered basically a deal between the Afghan government and a very prominent, extremely well-connected construction firm called Morrison Knudsen, which has a huge presence in the American West. Among other things, they were involved in the construction of what we call the Hoover Dam. It's my understanding they also played a role in our public transportation system out here, the BART. And MK Morrison Knudsen was very well connected, very well wired in Washington. It seems very clear to me that U.S. personnel in Afghanistan were basically putting them in touch with the Afghan government. And the Afghans asked Morrison Knudsen to engage in a hydroelectric and irrigation project in the south of Afghanistan in the Helmand Valley. And Morrison Knudsen just sort of rushed to conclude the contract. Here I should pause because this was not necessarily a great idea. This contract involved a lot of flawed assumptions about what could be done in the lands in question. There was a survey phase. Morrison Knudsen was not the only company to consider it. Someone who was acting on behalf of Kaiser, a rival firm, looked at the lands in question in the south and in his notes saw quite a lot of surface salts. That was bad news for him in terms of any irrigation project. If there was salt on the ground, very likely irrigation would make that problem worse. It would elevate salts toward the surface and actually have a poisoning effect on the land. And he communicated his concerns to the State Department representative in Kabul, who cabled them to Washington. But no one seems to have acted on that. Instead, within months, this rival firm, Morrison Knudsen, concluded the contract and seems to have been determined to look the other way on the salt issue, on the fact that the soil quality in this area just wasn't very good. And so when they went forward, when the irrigation project actually came to fruition, you just get these absolutely dismal accounts of just salt-ravaged land bearing stunted, anemic crops. The Afghan government was attempting to settle nomads in the area. That was this whole other crazy aspect of the project, because nomads are not necessarily aspiring to be settled on a random patch of land already, but if you try to settle them on a land that's growing miserable crops, they're going to say, I do have a plan B that was working very well for me until very recently, so I'm just going to go back to that. Thanks. The whole thing went terribly, and it put the United States on the hook. Let me take you back to the fact that this was ostensibly being done by a private contractor. At the end of the day, it's under the same flag. People would look at Morrison Knudsen's efforts and say, this is a U.S. project. The State Department had kidded itself by saying, well, we'll put these private contractors into this and we won't be directly involved. Oh, no, they would be directly involved. And they had been, among other things, promoting the contract, working to assuage Afghan concerns about it, working to help Morrison Knudsen transport equipment. And the Afghans had contracted with Morrison Knudsen because they understood this company was wired in Washington, that it would enjoy very strong support from the U.S. government. They weren't naive about how well that company related to the U.S. government. So that's stage one. And then with stage two, the United States is working through a variety of different means to try to rescue Morrison Knudsen from this folly of its own making, but also then to build, the further we get into the 1950s, to build U.S. prestige within Afghanistan, to try to present the Afghans with a concrete alternative to these massive Soviet projects that are happening in the north, that are happening in and around Kabul. And the United States tells itself it will not be competing with the Soviets on each project. But it kind of winds up doing that anyway. It winds up trying to have a counterbid whenever that is possible. Because I think in the heat of the moment, the spirit of the competition pervades all. And the United States wants to ready a counterbid. Probably the best known, and here I should credit my colleague Jennifer Van Vleck, the best known U.S. effort is in the field of aviation. The United States brings Pan American Airways into Afghanistan to work with the Afghan kingdom in developing a local airline, Ariana. The United States engages in airport construction, most notably in the south. It builds this amazingly gaudy, I think architecturally nice airport in Kandahar, but the estimate was that Kandahar would be this national hub and also would get a lot of transcontinental traffic. The problem was actually that the ranges of airplanes were growing widely. The jet was about to be adopted by this point in the mid-50s. So Kandahar would actually get several dozen passengers per week rather than hundreds or thousands. It would basically be the terrible white elephant of a project. But the United States was also involved in other elements of the Afghan aviation system, building airports elsewhere in a really peculiar and I think really interesting episode that it wound up having this entirely technical and civil dialogue with the Soviets. The Soviets got to build Kabul airport, but they had to build Kabul. Aviation can't be subdivided. You can't have one airport here that's operating by one aviation system and another there operating by a different one. Afghanistan had to have an integrated system. So the Americans and the Soviets, because the Afghans had sort of played this so well, had to have this very civil, very technical dialogue about how all these airports would coexist, how Afghanistan would be brought into the international civil aviation system. And remarkably, they did. I think they all understood that they needed to perform, they needed to behave themselves in this context. I think over time, both sides in the superpower contest were wise to the fact that the Afghans were pitting them against each other, and the Afghan reputation for doing this preceded them. And by the time you get into the 60s, the Americans and the Soviets are talking to each other with great regularity. And also, they both have the sense that this is not the most urgent competition between them, and they're fine with the status quo. They've concluded that a neutral, independent Afghanistan is a problem to neither of them, and that they'd like to rein in their Cold War competition, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And competition in places like Afghanistan doesn't serve their purposes very much. They've set aside, at least for a little bit, the images they have of each other as engaged in sort of one or another menacing project. Americans have stopped thinking that the Soviets are going to use Afghanistan as an invasion route into somewhere. The Soviets have come to realize that the Americans are also fatigued with Afghan aid requests and are probably not going to bring Afghanistan into their alliance system. They're probably not going to, because the difficulties of doing that are tremendous. You can't have an alliance system that has antagonistic states. The Americans had already committed very hastily to Pakistan, with which Afghanistan has a long-standing border dispute. So you can't bring them both on side. And so you get this interesting kind of what I call localized détente, as the Americans and Soviets are talking to each other, and they've agreed to coexist with each other within Afghanistan, at least informally. And that makes the end of the story all the worse, all the more tragic, because they lost that tacit agreement somehow. Even as I think they hadn't fundamentally changed how they valued the country, but if you flip a bit ahead, they lost their capacity to have a kind of calm, objective dialogue about it.
Well, let's flip ahead because that's something that is the tragedy of the story, really, because there's this moment of peaceful coexistence. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Détente, you call it a détente. Okay, great. Like a localized détente, which I like that. I like that phrasing. Sort of foreshadows the larger détente that comes in the 1970s, I think, globally. But this localized détente is very interesting to me. But of course, that goes south. You frame it as a crisis, a crisis moment in this entire history. Explain how this works, and what gets us to this crisis point and where things start to unravel.
Yeah. I come back to the important role of local diplomacy in this, and that kind of takes me back a bit to a critical realization I had about how I was going to research and write this. The prior book basically could just hinge on what I found at the White House level in the National Security Council, because that was where the action was. There was this one active, if not hyperactive, National Security Council staffer who was, for me, at least 50% of the story. I quickly realized researching this that it couldn't be told through presidential libraries. Some presidencies were pretty attentive to Afghanistan, some weren't. The story at the end of the day would hinge on local representatives. It would hinge on diplomats in Kabul. And that was interesting to me because it brought me in contact with this bunch of ensemble characters, with people who I hadn't otherwise much encountered, who are not otherwise famous in a Cold War context, but who are still really important by virtue of the decisions they made. They were thousands and thousands of miles away from Washington. They'd have considerable autonomy, and their choices on the ground would be pivotal. Washington, the U.S. government would defer to them often in terms of making sense of Afghanistan. There were no Afghan experts in the United States, not meaningfully, for quite a while. And the U.S. diplomats, U.S. representatives in Afghanistan would have great authority in terms of describing what was happening within the country and making policy recommendations. I mean, up to a point, they couldn't say, "Please give us $5 billion for this project." That would break the bank. That wouldn't be budgetarily feasible. But they could offer their impressions about one or another development, and that would carry weight. Uh, so that local diplomatic element is, I think, important to the story, because I think it doesn't always work in a calming way. You mentioned the how to put this politely, crazy cat person in chapter 4.
I'm not gonna take offense at that. Everybody knows that I'm a crazy cat person too, but
Okay, yeah, and none intended. Yeah, yeah. This is an ambassador, Angus Ward, who's a really interesting character. He had been held captive by the PRC, by the Chinese communists in 1948-49. He left Kabul when Nikita Khrushchev was visiting because he didn't want to shake any Soviet people's hands. He had strong feelings about communism, and his embassy tended to offer a very alarmist interpretation of what the Soviets were up to in Afghanistan at a very pivotal time. However, you go forward in time, and often enough, the diplomats who are present, I mean, they don't have warm feelings toward communism either, but they also don't think the Soviets are up to much, especially within Afghanistan. The Soviet policy seems to be sort of status quo oriented. For much of the time, especially for the crucial mid-70s period, Afghanistan was a republic under President then Mohammed Daoud Khan, who was a very familiar figure, a staunch Pashtun nationalist. Neither side really tended to think that Daoud was up to much in particular beyond his very familiar agenda of agitating for Pashtun self-determination in Pakistan. It was difficult to say that he was going to do something dramatic in a Cold War context. He was that familiar, and that arguably worked for him. He, though, was overthrown in a coup at the end of April 1978, which brought a very strange, violent group of Afghan Marxists to power. And this is where the situation started to fall apart. One of, I think, the key restraining factors on Afghanistan within the Cold War was having familiar people in power. Daoud, previously his cousin, the king, whom he'd overthrown when he came to power in 73. But suddenly there was this violent and unpredictable government in power in Kabul, which the Soviets were actually not wild about. I try to take a skeptical view toward the sort of more conspiratorial accounts of things that happened in Afghanistan in the late 70s. There's not much evidence that the Soviets had meaningful prior involvement in the coup in April 78. They probably understood something was underway, but the best we know is that this wasn't their idea, and they didn't like it at all. They just wanted to take a step back, so if it went south, which it very well could have, they wouldn't be implicated in it. Daoud wouldn't lash out against them. But then they find, oh, actually, there's this government that says it's our friends, that is Marxist, and we will need to work with that. Because by 78, the state of détente itself was not terrific. And they were already contemplating the loss of Egypt, which had previously been a quasi-ally of sorts, but which was clearly veering toward the United States. And the Soviets seem to have had this no more Egypt mentality. So they got into this partnership with the government in power of now the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, which was, there's layers of this, which was led by a party called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, but within the PDPA, there was the dominant faction, the Khalq, led basically by the Khalq, which was the faction the Soviets didn't trust, which seemed to be violent, nationalistic, and also just, very, very bloody in terms of how it handled domestic opposition. In one of any number of really revealing passages, the Soviet ambassador was informing the Khalqist leadership, it's not okay to kill an entire village, to bomb an entire village because some of its inhabitants have rebelled against you. Please refrain from collective punishment in that way, which the Khalq disregarded that kind of counsel. The U.S., though, the heart of the story, the U.S. was also struggling to understand who exactly he was dealing with. One of the strange elements of this is that the Khalq the Hulk leadership had spent more time in the United States than the Soviet Union. That's one reason why the Soviets didn't trust it very much. The president of Afghanistan had been an employee of the Afghan embassy in Washington in the early 1950s and was actually a U.S. contact into the mid 1960s. Nur Mohammad Taraki, his deputy and ultimately successor, because he was murdered by him, Hafizullah Amin, had been a graduate student in English literature at Columbia University. So one of the great counterfactuals is, what if Amin had really taken off as a scholar of English literature? What world would we be living in? The Soviets didn't trust him either, and there's this notion that he was a U.S. spy, although I haven't found anything to document that, and I don't really credit that. But Americans are trying to make sense of these folks. And the interesting thing is that the Hulk was asking for U.S. assistance, was saying, hey, we still want to be non-aligned. Not that much has changed. You should continue to give us money. We won't be that bad for you. Trust us. And Americans were not taking that at face value, but they were willing to engage in a kind of wait and see policy. Because even if the Hulk were ardent Marxists, by 1978-79, it's clear that Marxists have a hard time staying on the same page with each other. The Sino-Soviet split was by this point easily 15 years old. Yugoslavia had broken with Stalin 3 decades earlier. Let's just play the long game here was the thinking. At least it was the thinking when the U.S. ambassador Adolf Dubs, known to everybody as Spike, was on the scene. Dubs was a fascinating guy. Everyone really liked him quite a bit. He'd spent considerable time in Moscow, and he was like, "Look, let's not read this situation too fearfully. Let's just maintain the dialogue and see what happens." He wasn't saying that these are lovely people, and they can be our future allies, but it need not concern us overly at this point in time. Unfortunately, and this is probably the most inexplicable part of the story, on February 14, 1979, he was briefly taken captive by kidnappers purporting to represent a Maoist group in Kabul. There are not a lot of Maoists in Kabul. He was taken into a hotel room and held captive. And even as U.S. diplomats were pleading with the Afghan authorities to negotiate, they made preparations to storm the room, which they did. Ambassador Dubs, who was the most important, the foremost voice of a kind of wait and see policy, was killed in the crossfire. And lots of elements of this did not add up. A lot of forensic details of this did not make any sense. There were more bodies recovered than there should have been. The bullets and the guns didn't match properly. It was all quite strange. But with his death, the United States lost that foremost advocate, the person who was able to practice local diplomacy. The U.S. diplomats in Kabul had to necessarily enter a bunker mentality. Their presence was drawn down very dramatically. It was a very unsafe place to be. And they detested the Soviets and they detested the Afghans. And the best thing you can say about the Soviets and the Afghans is that they behaved recklessly. I give it a little bit of credence. It's worth mulling the possibility that Amin might have had some meaningful complicity in Dubs's death on February 14. What that means, well, obviously localized détente's gone, but you lose any kind of localized channel with the Soviets. You lose any voice against confronting the Soviets in Afghanistan. And within weeks of that, the western city of Herat erupted into revolt against the Afghan government and also against their Soviet advisors. And the Carter administration was willing to at least rhetorically confront the Soviets over Afghanistan. The Carter administration also did not give as much attention to interesting conversations held with Soviet and East German diplomats in the summer of '79, where the Soviets and the East Germans were saying, look, we don't like this government. We're going to try to put something else in power. Let me stop short here because it's quite likely some proportion of your audience are wondering, is he going to say the Carter administration wanted to lure the Soviets into Afghanistan? I just don't find them talking about Afghanistan in that way and with that volume. I don't think they had a policy that was that far advanced. And when they do talk about the Soviets in Afghanistan, they're talking about how they don't want to see the Soviets further immersed in there. They don't, because for them, it would embarrass the United States regionally. It would create doubt, foster doubt in the credibility of U.S. commitments along the entire Indian Ocean periphery. It's something that they want to avoid. It's something that they want to avoid rather than something that they want to encourage. There's one of those sort of bright, shiny objects of historical discussions out there. Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, had reportedly been quoted in a late 90s article saying that he'd worked to lure the Soviets into Afghanistan. Brzezinski himself contested that quote. He said it wasn't brought to him for review. Brzezinski was not a bashful guy, by the way. If he had said something, he tended to stand by it. He didn't mince his words. He didn't engage in much correction. And there's no documentary evidence here that that was his plan. For him, it wasn't a question of luring the Soviets into Afghanistan. He saw the Soviets as naturally expansionistic. The question is, was the United States going to wave a bright stop sign and tell them back off? Or was the United States going to miss yet another opportunity to demonstrate its resolve in the face of Soviet expansion? He was fearful that this was going to be the latter case because he was still arguing within his administration about the proper policy toward the Soviets. But circling back to the question, we have this kind of collapse both of competent Afghan governance, which had been the vital element to keeping the Afghans out of the Cold War, letting them be basically beneficiaries of it, but also this collapse of U.S. diplomacy, which was critical in reinforcing that. And concurrently, we've got a willingness of governments on both sides to start thinking really wild thoughts about what Afghanistan means. The United States would start thinking that at times that the Soviets were moving through Afghanistan as a first stage of expansion towards the Persian Gulf, which they weren't. The Soviets would worry about various grand U.S. designs centered on Afghanistan, and the KGB chairman, who would later be General Secretary, Yuri Andropov, was telling Leonid Brezhnev, who let's say was past his prime at this point in time, absolutely bonkers, absolutely crazy things about what the United States intended to do in Afghanistan at this point in time. And all of this would lead to just complete calamity for Afghanistan. And most of these things have nothing, most of these causes, most of these factors had nothing to do with anything in Afghanistan. This is in terms of talking about the images affixed to the country, that these are the fantasies of people in Washington and Moscow.
And this is kind of where the story picks up when we're kids and we see all this, they see all this like kind of evolving in real time right in front of our face. And of course, I remember very clearly the political tensions that were happening in the early '80s between the Soviet Union and the United States, precisely over Afghanistan. And that's I think that's probably a good place to end. I'm gonna have to let you go, and we could talk about this all day. So maybe we should have part 2 of this conversation. But until then, because I'm interested in a couple of other things. But until then, I highly advise everybody to read Days of Opportunity, which was a wonderful book. And Rob, I thank you so much for coming on and having this great conversation.
Thanks so much, Keith. It's always a pleasure to talk history with you, and I really appreciate your questions.
And you know what? We live on the same coast. We should. I know we live. California is a big place, but if you're in LA, definitely look me up. And if I'm in the Bay Area, then I will reciprocate. And we should at least grab a coffee or something.
Yeah. That'd be terrific.
All right, Rob. Well, thanks so much. We'll see you soon.